Hello, my name is Ed Llewellyn and I am Professor of Volcanology at Durham University in the UK. First of all, I'd like to thank the session organisers very much for inviting me to give this keynote talk. I've been asked to give an overview of the state of the art and future directions in magma rheology. This is a very broad topic and much too broad to go into in any great depth in a 15-minute presentation, so this is necessarily an overview and it's also a personal view. There is, of course, a lot of excellent recent and ongoing research that I won't have time to go into in this talk. So why do we care about magma rheology? Whenever magma moves, the rheology matters. When a stress is applied to magma, the rheology dictates the nature of the subsequent motion, and magma movement underpins every aspect of volcanology. In this example from the 2018 Lower East Rift Zone eruption, low viscosity magma moves easily when the stress is applied, leading to gentle fountains and flows. The rheology dictates how the vents localize and where the flows will go. In this dome-forming eruption from Mount St Helens in 2006, the magma is 100 million times more viscous, but can still ooze slowly, forming a dome. High viscosity magma also has a tendency to erupt explosively, as in this eruption of Kolyma in 2017. Again, rheology dictates whether and when magma will fragment to form an explosive eruption. Rheology is therefore important throughout a magma's journey through the crust and over the Earth's surface. The questions that require an understanding of rheology include some of the grand challenges in volcanology. How can a magma mush become mobile? How do magmas mix efficiently? And will the magma erupt explosively or effusively? One of the reasons that these questions are hard is because magma is such a rheologically complex material. Viscosity, which is the most important manifestation of rheology, varies over more than 10 orders of magnitude for pure silicate melts, depending on the melt's chemical composition and its temperature. Furthermore, magma in the crust is rarely a single-phase melt, but is invariably a multi-phase suspension of liquid melt, solid crystals, and gas bubbles. The componentry has an enormous impact on viscosity, but also introduces all manner of non-Newtonian behaviours, including shear thinning, shear thickening, and viscoelasticity. This simple representation of the phase proportions also hides the fact that the size and shape distributions of the phases has an important influence on rheology. Rheology of multiphase suspensions also depends on the nature of the deformation experienced by the material. For non-Newtonian materials, the apparent viscosity depends on the strain rate, that is, how fast the material is being deformed. An even more challenging complexity is that rheology also often depends on the shear history experienced by a packet of magma. In this example of a crystal-rich magma analogue from Kariki et al., localization planes develop at high strains, affecting the subsequent response of the magma to further deformation. So, if we want to predict the response of a magma to an applied stress, it's not enough to know the instantaneous conditions, we also need to know the sample's deformation history. Perhaps the most complicating factor is that composition, temperature, componentry, and deformation can all vary dramatically in time and space as magma moves through and over the crust. We can illustrate this with an idealized cartoon of a hybrid effusive explosive eruption. This could be, for example, a silicic eruption like Chaiten in 2008, or a Hawaiian fountain that produces rheomorphic lava flows. At depth, we start with something close to a pure melt. That likely stalls in a crustal reservoir where it undergoes some degree of crystallization, possibly even becoming a locked mush. We then have some triggering event, perhaps bubble formation, that causes separation of a melt with low crystal and gas content, leading to a discontinuity in the componentry of the magma of interest. As that magma ascends, decompression and exsolution drive dramatic bubble growth. If growth is sufficiently rapid, the magma fragments, another discontinuity. The fragments may then re-weld either in the conduit or outside the vent. There is then further growth of bubbles as volatiles continue to exsolve, then loss of bubbles and growth of crystals during transport leads to a variably crystalline and porous final rock. During its journey, the magma has covered almost the whole of the ternary diagram and will have been experiencing simultaneously changes in major element and volatile composition of the melt, changes in temperature, changes in crystal and bubble size and shape, and changes in shear environment. Despite this daunting complexity, we have made great progress over the last few decades. I'll use this journey to give a brief and very incomplete overview of the current state of the art and highlight some frontier topics where progress is needed. We start with the rheology of pure silicate melts. This is fairly well understood. Direct measurements of the viscosity of supraliquidus melts and of metastable melts just above the glass transition temperature have been made over a very wide range of major element compositions, volatile contents, and temperatures. These data have been aggregated and analysed to produce general models for melt viscosity, the most widely used of which is that of Giordano et al. This spreadsheet is probably familiar to many of you. You just plug in the major element composition, water concentration, and it gives the viscosity of the melt as a function of temperature. But there is still work to do. The general models are only as good as the data on which they are built. Further data would be valuable for some compositions, perhaps most notably for peralkaline melts. Even more valuable would be a deeper theoretical understanding of the molecular controls on viscosity. A complete theoretical model would allow viscosity to be computed ab initio from composition. Some very promising work by Lelosque, Giordano and others has used Raman spectroscopy to investigate melt structure and relate that to viscosity. This is an important step in the direction of a general theoretical model. There is still more to understand about the relationship between viscosity and melt failure as well. Seminal work by Dingwell and others in the 90s demonstrated the importance of strain rate and structural relaxation time in determining failure, but there is still more to understand. What role, for example, does viscous heating play in failure? This has been the subject of a recent investigation by Wadsworth et al. Continuing our journey, what happens to the rheology of magma as the melt starts to crystallize? Analog experiments show that viscosity increases at first slowly and then very rapidly as crystal content increases. This depends on the shape of the crystals. Viscosity increases more rapidly for particles of higher aspect ratio than it does for particles of low aspect ratio. The rheology is well captured via a constitutive relationship between stress and strain rate. This is couched in terms of the crystal fraction and the maximum packing fraction, which is in turn a function of the particle aspect ratio. The major disadvantage of analog experiments is that they do not capture disequilibrium, which leads to crystal growth during deformation. This has an important influence on rheology, which we're just starting to understand, thanks to work by Kolzenberg and others. Our understanding of rheology is best at low concentrations and becomes much shakier as we approach maximum packing fraction. Indeed, magmatic systems can crystallize to well above maximum packing fraction and still accommodate strain. More work is required to understand rheology of concentrated and superconcentrated suspensions, and this is particularly important for understanding the relationship between rheology and mobilization of crystal mushes. There are fundamental aspects of the rheology of particle suspensions that are still not understood. For example, we do not know what the controlling timescale is for particle suspensions. This means that we can't normalize strain rates to arrive at a non-dimensional description of shear thinning behavior. If we follow our magma as it ascends through the subvolcanic plumbing system, decompression and degassing cause bubble growth, so that we have to care about the effect that bubbles have on rheology. Here, experiments with analog, synthetic and natural magmas have led us to a fairly mature understanding of rheology of bubble suspensions at modest gas fractions. We find that the effect of bubbles is strongly dependent on the shear environment. Whereas crystals always increase the apparent viscosity of magma, bubbles increase viscosity at low strain rates, but decrease viscosity at high strain rates. The viscosity of bubble suspensions can be expressed as a function of the gas volume fraction and the dimensionless capillary number. There is still a lot we don't understand about bubble suspension rheology. A significant issue is that rheometry of natural bubbly magmas and analogues do not always agree. This is the model prediction based on analog experiments, and these data are from experiments on natural bubbly magmas. The solution here is perhaps to conduct paired investigations, where analogues are designed to match textural characteristics of a specific natural sample as closely as possible, and rheometry is done on both. This will help us to understand what important complexities are missing from analog work. As with particle suspensions, bubble suspension rheology is best understood for low and intermediate suspended fraction, and more experiments are required to span the gap between bubble suspensions and foams. In natural magmas, bubbles ubiquitously coalesce, break up, and outgas during transport. We do not have a good understanding of the impact of these processes on rheology. And while shear viscosity is fairly well understood, viscoelasticity and bulk rheology, which determines the response to volume changes, require further investigation. The rheology of two-phase suspensions is moderately well understood, though, as we have seen, many important gaps in our understanding remain. understanding of the rheology of three-phase suspensions is, by comparison, in its infancy. Analog experiments have revealed interesting and superficially counterintuitive behaviour. This plot shows the viscosity of a three-phase suspension against the particle fraction and contoured for bubble fraction. At low particle fraction, the bubbles increase the viscosity of the particle suspension, but at high particle fraction, the bubbles decrease the viscosity. This is not a capillary effect. All of these experiments are in the low capillary number regime where bubbles should increase viscosity. However, the bubbles also push the particles apart, decreasing their impact on viscosity, and at high enough particle fraction, this effect dominates. These experiments have allowed us to validate a simple model for low to intermediate total suspended fraction. The rheology of the three-phase suspension is the simple convolution of the effect of bubbles and the effect of particles. In this scheme, either the bubbly liquid is treated as an effective medium that suspends the crystals, or the crystal-bearing liquid is treated as an effective medium that suspends the bubbles. This depends on whether the crystals are much larger than the bubbles or vice versa. But this doesn't work if the crystals and bubbles are similar sizes. More generally, we don't have a good theoretical understanding of how to determine rheology where interactions among the various suspended phases are important. And it's not just the interactions between bubbles and crystals that matter, but between populations of crystals of different sizes and shapes and bubbles of different sizes. More generally, experiments with natural and synthetic three-phase magmas have shown that textural heterogeneities develop under deformation. These include the formation of shear bands and ruptured bubbles. These must have an important influence on rheology. They also become more important at higher concentrations, and as for the two-phase cases, work so far has focused on dilute and intermediate suspended fractions. Heterogeneities also likely influence the failure of the magma. The failure of pure melt is fairly well understood, but most natural magmas are complex three-phase mixtures at the point of failure. Much more work is required to understand the conditions under which three-phase magmas fail, and this is crucial to understanding the fragmentation process and whether the magma erupts explosively or effusively. Some of the frontier topics I have identified simply require more work of the sort that has gone on for years, but there are also new tools available to us which are likely to have a transformative impact. In situ X-ray tomography is already having a major impact across the geosciences. In rheology, synchrotron source tomography allows us to image multiphase samples in 3D during deformation. This technique will be invaluable as we attempt to build models for multiphase rheology that account for the interactions amongst the suspended particles and bubbles. As I mentioned earlier, disequilibrium in natural systems, which leads to crystal and bubble growth, has an important effect on rheology, which is hard or impossible to replicate with analogues. A new generation of high-pressure, high-temperature rheometer is under development, which will allow rheometry to be conducted on samples of natural magma that are undergoing natural pressure-temperature pathways relevant to the subvolcanic plumbing system. There are new numerical tools at our disposal too. Simulations of deforming multiphase materials are moving from 2D to 3D. When combined with experimental rheometry data, particularly from X-ray computed tomography rheometry, this could be hugely valuable in developing new rheological models that account for phase interactions at the microscale. I'd like to finish with a brief personal perspective on the most pressing challenges for the discipline. Further experiments are required to populate ternary phase space with rheological data. Most of the ternary space is almost unknown. Related to this, we need a theory for phase interactions. Once we get to intermediate and concentrated suspensions, interactions dominate. Direct observation of interactions through X-ray computed tomography and direct numerical simulation offer a new way forward here. We need to develop ways to account for sample history. Magma experiences dramatic changes on its journey through and over the crust, and the history of these changes, up to any point in time, influence its rheological response at that point in time. Related to this, we need to develop ways to deal with this equilibrium. Magma is out of equilibrium for much of its journey through and over the crust. This leads to chemical, structural, and textural disequilibrium that influence all aspects of rheology. Experiments on natural materials under disequilibrium conditions are essential. Finally, we must remember that the purpose of investigating magma rheology is ultimately to help us develop better models of magma and lava flow. Rheological models should be couched in terms that support implementation in numerical models of fluid dynamics, and these models need to account for variations in rheology over space and time. I'd like to finish by thanking those who I've worked with and discussed rheology with over the last 2 decades, and who have helped shape my understanding of magma rheology.